This forest is home to divinely sanctioned empires, bloody stories of betrayal, and a whimsical old mouse living in a mushroom who's reading a book on a table made from a poker chip. This is the Coda Lakes, where hundreds of years ago, the gods placed down a field that repels predators away. And in that security, there developed a grand playground of mouse tribes and civilizations. Today, we look at the histories of a mighty empire of mice through the eyes of a traveling visitor from a faraway land. This video is an addendum to my video on how to world build history. This is an example of the twists and turns and developing trends that world building history should have. So now let us take some time and explore the rise and fall of the Bowland Kingdom. My master lord Kulerikusa, I report to you happily, with good demeanor and station. Some time into my travels on the Giant's Road, I had come upon the kingdom of the Bowllanders, or as they call themselves in their tongue, the Urmulur, meaning House of the Mountain Forests. They are a strange people indeed, in this most isolated realm from the rest of civilization, insulated by cold winds and a decrepit puppet kingship. In the capital city they call Wathketro, I had the fortune to be recognized as a scholar among the simple market people, and so some bold and brash men showed me to their superiors who oversaw our parts of the city, and I was thus moved to the temple in the city's palace that I may impart my knowledge of our civilized trades of E-Maka to these superstitious people. You will find it to my surprise, then, that when I entered into the temple, they shared many of our same gods. Our Kulerifo, Lord of Roads, is to them called Kudreov. Yosp, the war-winning god, is called Yothux, and our Yaha, Lord of Life, is their Yaks. There is no doubt that they have many misinterpretations and superstitions, especially of the neighboring alien tribes among the statues of our own gods, but that such a faraway and deficient people should know of our gods by traces of their identity shows their true universal magnificence and grace. It was here that we engaged in conversations, and I was witness to rituals more superstitious and secluded than our own, for the public has no right to see such things occur in these secluded temples. But a member of the royal family was said to be present, but truthfully all manner of priests were dressed in such lavish variations that I could not tell which among them was a prince. After this and a light meal, I was brought with my interpreter to the home of an old man, an elder of the Temple of Yaks. The home was a large dead mushroom, covered in tar sap with many planks boarding around it to enclose the space. Inside, in the mushroom's hollowed stem, he had a fire going with a pot made from a giant's bottle cap, which roasted some kind of stew inside of it. We sat around a flat table on the ground made from a giant's poker chip. Obviously, the wealth of ancient enchanted artifacts here was astonishing to say the least, for the priests here enjoy great wealth and prosperity. It was here that the old man recounted in verse his understanding of the kingdom's mythologies and histories, which I shall recount as they were translated to me. He first sang the Song of the West, which tells the story of their first princes and kings. The people of the Bowland Kingdom initially hailed as a tribe in the high Overmons Mountains during the ancient days of the Bullbriar Empire. Upon threat of invasion from the Empire and surrounding tribes, this tribe's king and prince quarreled about how they would respond. That night, the prince had a dream where a messenger of the life-giving lord, Yaks, issued to him a prophecy that he would not sleep a restful night and that the sons of his tribes would die until he traveled so far east that the cold winds would block his path. So, in the middle of the night, he gathered his family and much of his tribe and left eastward, and the next day those who remained were crushed in battle and enslaved into the Bullbriar's empire. They traveled for many months until they reached the prosperous merchant city of Eldisa, which sat at the productive crossroads of the Giant's Road and the Nial River. They established themselves and grew to fulfill many roles of the city, especially during the winter. As the prince became a prominent leader in the city, especially over his own people, he had an illicit affair with the Eldisan queen Meluloth. This began the resentment among the Eldisans as they saw this new group rising in power in favor of the queen, especially as she birthed a litter of babies that were of the prince. For a year, this anger stirred, until the queen's new litter was grown and had reached maturity. But the trickster god they call Kuthax stirred a conspiracy among the Eldizans, and in the night, the nobility abducted the oldest child of the prince and the queen and sacrificed him to their malevolent gods, peeling off his fur and skin before burning him to death. Prince and his tribe were horrified at this, and they occupied and made great unrest in the city's market until the murderous nobles were brought to justice. The nobles then locked the queen away in her palace and addressed the people, accusing the prince and his tribe of a conspiracy to put the now flayed child on the throne. And so they brought forth the older Eldizan children of Queen Meluloth and hailed them as the heirs of the throne, and he ordered that the children of the prince and the queen be banished or executed. At this started a fight in the market, where aluminum swords clashed and needle spears shook and shattered. The children of the Eldizans and children of the prince fought upon the walls of the inner city, and many were slain as blood ran down the streets. During the fight came a rare sight from above. A monstrous hawk sent by the malevolent gods descended upon the city and began killing scores of the prince's tribe. But the prince knocked a flaming arrow and fired it into the hawk's face, and it caught fire and fell upon the city, lighting it into great flames which engulfed the whole city. The prince hurriedly rounded up his people and many Eldizan civilians, and they escaped the burning carnage, fleeing further eastward. All of his children were lost in the conflict, and so, with the torching city in the horizon, the prince turned around and swore that he would return to the city and avenge the queen and his sons. This tribe of refugees then descended into the center of the Bowlland, and while they were foraging for food, they came upon little cyan peppers that they ate, which gave them cold shivers and then extreme warmth, and made them hallucinate in euphoria. In the people's consumption of these native peppers, they all felt the great cold winds of the mountain come down upon them until they could not stand without stumbling back, and in the clouds of the cold sky, they saw the arms of the gods spread out before them. So this is where they settled their capital city of Wathketro, and the prince took the new name of Meluloth, which means Lord over the Mountains, and took a wife from the refugees of Eldisa, and they became the first Bowllanders. But these lands were not uninhabited, for around them were many small and ignorant tribes that made trouble for the Bowllanders. So Meluloth went counterclockwise around the Bowland Valley to each of the tribes and settled a deal with them all, that this city would be a trade hub for all to gather, where all would be equally protected and none would start a fight. King Meluloth ran his city and people for many years, and he had a single son that survived past infancy into adulthood. But when his son died of illness, Meluloth succumbed to grief and became very sick. One of his advisors at this time, named Thayankre, led a procession counterclockwise around the Bowland Valley to demand gifts of the drug-like cold snap peppers for the sick and grief King Meluloth. Meluloth accepted the pile of peppers and distributed them among the tribe's nobility and priests in a great ritual, and he adopted Thayankre into his own family and died soon after. So Thayankre rose to the throne and established himself as a king in the Eldizan sense of the word, whereas the Eldizan royals wore shiny yellow crowns in emulation of the ancient giants. Thayankre had a shiny blue crown forged from the giant's magical plastic, and he held a great coronation party that hosted many of the neighboring tribes. At this party, Thayankre became friends with leaders of the southern hill tribes of the Bowland, and he established a great peace with them and adopted many of them as his advisors. Afterwards, Thayankre established many temples and set up the religious customs of the whole Bowland, giving preeminent power over all the temples to the priesthood of the life-giving lord Yox. But King Thayankre soon fell ill and comatose, and while he was on his deathbed, his sons fought for the throne in bloody brawls in the streets, with help from different surrounding tribes. Thayankre died without a clear line of who would get the throne, so his advisors from the southern hill tribes snuck many warriors into the city under the guise of them being merchants, and at a signal, they all erupted into a riot that accosted the innocent people of the city in every sort of looting, pillaging, and violence for 4 days. Out of this rose one of the contestant sons of Thayankre, called Tiathkorh. As a boy, he had taken fascination in the stories of the old Bullbriar Empire back out west, and so he organized a defense against the rebelling tribesmen in that old manner. So he held the city's men in a mobile wall of shields that either drove out the vicious savages or pinned them to the walls of the homes for their execution. The armies of the southern hill tribes were routed out of the city and returned to their homeland. Tiathkorh then hastily had himself coronated with the blue crown of his father, and brought his army out to the southern hills to face off with the tribes and take revenge. Upon reaching the battlefield, though, a diviner from the hill tribes came upon Tiathkorh and his army, and he called upon the life-giving lord Yaks, and he told Tiathkorh that drawing blood here would incur a blood debt. If he should win this battle, the gods would be offended. Tiathkorh ordered the diviner slain, but he hastily gave another prophecy, that should he sacrifice one man, all of the Bowlland shall be his. So Tiathkorh let the diviner go and set up for battle. In this time, the hill tribes around here fought battles over land in a ritualistic fashion, as they danced and warriors stepped forward to mock their enemies. Usually, episodes of single combat would precipitate the winning duelist's army charging forward and capturing a handful of warriors to parade around their home villages and torture to death. But in this instance, Tiathkorh sent a single man forward with the objective to die as an honorable sacrifice. This was the Bowllander hero, Bramax, about which there are many stories of his trials that I was not told, until he died here, with his scalp being cut off in single ritualistic combat. The southern hill tribes rushed their army forward, and Tiathkorh feigned a retreat, but he turned his army around and formed a tight shield wall with the most experienced fighters protecting his sides. The loose tribesmen crashed into the shields and were all slain by their spears and axes. In this victory, the southern hill tribes were immediately pacified. High on his glories now, Tiathkorh swept counterclockwise through the Bowland and pacified all the land of its hills and basin under his banner. After this campaign of the Bowland, he swept around it again in a triumphal manner to establish himself as the indisputable ruler of the land, which was the first triumphal procession of his line of warlike kings. With martial confidence, he then turned his sight to Eldisa, the glorious and civilized city of the rich nobles that dominated trade over the entire region. As he led his army into the swamps to ford across the Nial River, there came a flash flood that swept him away and buried his body unceremoniously beneath the silt. Tiathkorh's nephew, Aluy, was then elected to the throne. Aluy Ruthin was a skilled man who learned many things by serving in his father's conquests. He saw how tenuous Wathkran's grasp over the surrounding land was, and how little use he would be at the head of a single army in his newly expanded state. So he gathered the generals, priests, and council of advisors that elected him to the throne, and he delegated their responsibilities into what is called the Order of Three. As king, he kept the military and leadership over the generals to himself. To the priests and healers, he gave the responsibility of keeping the gods pleased, dictating the public's morality, and writing the king's edicts into divinely sanctioned law. To the council members, he split up the city of Wathkran into 12 district moieties that would each be governed by a councillor, and he split up the whole territory of the Bowland into another 12 moieties that took the old tribal boundaries and overlapped them to break apart their old attachments. And he made these regional, tribal moieties answerable to those districts within the city. The councillors could collect their own taxes and trade among each other, but they would also have responsibilities, like soup kitchens open to the poor and facilitating good judgment and unbiased law among the people. So they became known as a new class, in their language called the Nulapraks, in ours called the Holders. This was the establishment of the Bowland Kingdom as it was set to rise, and the ending of the Song of the West. The contentment and pleasure of the old priest's face after he had recounted it to me implied that this story was very artistic and personal to my hosts. There was no doubt that this story has passed among many generations of the priesthood of Yaks, and so I find it honorable and worthy to give unto our priesthood back home of Yaha. The following day, I met with the old priest of Yaks once again, and he recounted the rest of his histories to me. I will admit that these stories were less fanciful and quite drier to retell, so I will adhere only to the significant details here for you. These later histories are remembered as their songs of the times, and are formatted as various hymns to their version of our time god, called Meluloth. There was no more information here on the exploits of King Aluy, for the chronology starts with his son Muyyako, who had led an army to crush a revolt by the southern hill tribes and extended the Bowlland's border further north against raids from tribes of mongrel rats. The next two kings, Wathketro and Kuthax, were not particularly liked or revered as leaders, for Wathketro maintained a fine apparatus of state but kept himself isolated in the palace and busy with nonsense hobbies, and his son Kuthax developed a severe addiction to the cold snap peppers that were supposed to be a ritual observance only. However, Kuthax did accidentally create the tradition of giving all the peasants of the city an expensive meal of cold snap peppers on public holidays, for he once ordered that the entire stockpile of the elite's supply be distributed out so that he might not indulge himself. King Kuthax died early of sickness though, and so the throne passed on to his brother Meluloth. As a young boy, Meluloth found fascination with the merchant class that traveled into the city and told him exotic stories, so he accompanied some merchant groups on several trips counterclockwise around the Bowlland, and around there he discovered a vast difference in wealth in the villages that the merchants stopped at and those that they did not. So when Meluloth rose to the throne, he changed the system of taxes and checkpoints, so that the merchants only had to pay taxes when entering the kingdom and the larger tax when they left. This angered the class of holders, as many of them could not benefit from the same market taxes, but they were in no position to do anything. So now, the merchants would spend more time in the kingdom and trade around to smaller and more niche areas, and as a result, the people and the kingdom grew far richer. With this wealth, Meluloth indulged his piety and commissioned great building projects for the temples, particularly of the god Yax, Yothux, Inin, and Pi. It was made abundantly clear to me that Meluloth was a grand and admirable king, even if his accomplishments were rather humble. Upon his death arose his adopted son, now called Thaltim the Great. King Thaltim cultivated a great relationship with many of the powerful generals, and he mobilized the kingdom's vast wealth and manpower, and he finally conquered the city of Eldisa. His armies snuck through the tunnels under the city that let the Nial River flow through the Giants' Road, and they appeared from within to loot the city and destroy its resistance. Thaltim's men then claimed to find the body of the old king Tiathkorh in the mud of the river, and so they demolished the Eldisans' temple to their malevolent gods into a pile of rubble. They placed the Tiathkorh body on top and burned it as a funeral offering to the war-winning god Yothux. With the Eldisans captured, Thaltim extracted the trade taxes through the city and directly built his own treasury. It was then that the Song of the West was commissioned to be written down and guided by the strong hand of King Thaltim. He then secured the loyalty of many of the city's most powerful holders by rearranging their moieties so that the Giants' Road was divided among them, and they could benefit from the trade equally and directly. He then launched a second campaign to conquer the tribes of the Underwallers' land, but he faced many significant setbacks, as they fought a new species of war where they never confronted his army in battle, but picked them off from the trees and the bushes. It was in this quagmire that Thaltim was killed by a poison arrow shot into his tail. This would have been the end of his campaign and perhaps the legacy of Thaltim were it not for his son Uthux, who acted as a commander of the armies. His son targeted the region's villages to draw the warriors out into an open battle, where they swiftly destroyed them and conquered the swampy regions. Uthux was not the designated heir of his great father due to his age and lack of connections within the city, but with the resounding success of this difficult campaign, he returned to the city as a hero, taking over the throne from his brother. His brother then fled the city with his faction of supporters from the holders and priestly class, and they all fled south to found the town of Pudreper. These lowly Pudreper mice retained a delusional culture of aristocracy and grandeur, even though they wallow in skill-less poverty. Even now, several decades later, they named their kids after the grandest titles of the kingdom. It is common to find beggars named Lord King of the Mountains, and scavengers named Grand Duke Earl, Protector of Men. They dress with crowns and capes made of poor, rough paper, sap, and leaves, and the largest structure of theirs is the giant's old aluminum can that gives the town its name. Aside from these things, though, the reign of Uthuks saw the Bowland Kingdom at its most powerful. He brought the faraway town of Halfway Land under his vassalship, which secured access to a mighty trade route of artifacts from the old giants, those needles, cans, aluminum, and plastic trinkets and wrappers that are dug out from the mighty landfill mountains, and sold and reforged as enchanted items of the best quality. He also deposed some of the old families of the holders to appoint some of his allies, and he encouraged his allied holders to set up militias in their own moieties, and he threw great festivals and games for the city's populace. Now, there were whispers that King Uthuks was indeed a helpless addict to the cold snap peppers that were now commonplace among every elite, as well as a sexual deviant who had many illegitimate litters with his many concubines. But the kingdom and monarchy overall was at its zenith, so no one dared complain. Uthuks died of old age, but was succeeded by one of his likely illegitimate children named Aliafath. King Aliafath, insecure in his legitimacy as king, sought the glory of conquest that brought his father and ancestors to the throne. So he immediately raised an army and attempted to take all the cities of the Nial River Valley. But the cities were well prepared for this, for they feared the Bowland ever since its capture of Old Eldisa. King Aliafath had initial victories and captured a couple of towns, but the coalition beat him back and inflicted great casualties among them. So he poured his money and manpower into this war in an attempt to brute force victory. But there was only a prolonged back and forth that lasted far longer than any campaign up until this point. Unrest within the leaders of the Bowland grew. So after a particularly crushing defeat at the Battle of Lineway, several of the holders cut off Aliafath's access to their money or manpower from their moieties. King Aliafath instead decided to levy more taxes on the markets of his city, in addition to the entrance and exit taxes levied previously by the king Fumeyoth. The merchants revolted over this, and they protested by camping right outside of the city of Wathketro. And they refused to pay taxes by not trading and not leaving the kingdom at all. Instead, they just paid people to bring them food or to commit petty crimes among the capital city. Aliafath responded by marching an army onto the camp, and after a tense standoff and a refusal of the king's threats, the merchants were butchered and scattered. This set off a wave of unrest, where many of the moieties rose up in revolt. A patchwork of pro-monarchists and insurrectionists dotted the land, and people of different moieties slew the officers and scholars of the monarchy. Some even went as far as to reclaim their tribal sovereignty under the old traditions and practices. Aliafath diverted all the war effort from the Nial Valley back onto the homeland, and after a few key battles with minor rebelling forces, the Civil War was put to an end. Aliafath then rewarded those holders that were loyal to him by letting them execute the other holders and confiscate their land and properties of the other moieties. On top of this, he gave a few powerful holders authority of the conquested territories of the Underwaller's land and of Eldisa. The unrest died down for the rest of King Aliafath's reign, and he fell ill and died not too long after these events. His son Futhaloy and daughter Thulalath both ascended the throne as a married couple. These two were the first royals that were visibly afflicted with a strange deformity caused by the cold snap peppers, where their heads were elongated, their ears and whiskers shriveled, and their eyes wide and glowing blue. King Futhaloy and his queen did not do much, as they did not want to stir any controversy as their father had, and they were held greatly accountable to the holders that owned large swaths of the empire. It was during their reign, though, that one of the minor holders, named Oentup, went to war with those other holders that owned lucrative sections of the Giants' Road. This civil war between governors, so to say, was the first among the holders, but the holder Owentup bribed the royals by securing the vassalship of the faraway town of Frogsland. And so the royal couple got to host their own triumphal parade around the Bowland kingdom, counterclockwise as always, and Owentup became a powerful man in the kingdom. When they died, their nephew, Tormeyoth, ascended the throne, but he was a clear puppet of the holder Owentup. The short-term vassal of Frogland was lost as they were raided by nomads, and Owentup traveled south to the Gyaritom Plateau to secure a favorable deal with those nomads who were starting to unify and make their presence felt by those around them. King Tormeyoth died in his sleep rather suddenly, and his brother, Laputh, ascended to the throne. Laputh was truly crippled by addiction and functionally unable to rule, so the holder Owentup spoke for him at council meetings and in public. But Owentup's puppetry was obvious and deeply unpopular with many factions of the kingdom, and soon he was assassinated. The other holders locked King Laputh in the palace with only a few attendants as they vied over control of the palace gate. This sparked brawls, skirmishes, and soon all were devolved into a civil war of the moieties. The young King Laputh was soon poisoned to death, and the royal line was, for the first time since the kingdom's founding, totally disrupted, and the traditional order of three consolidated in the power of the holders. The Civil War raged with incredible brutality for the right to rule the empire. Those holders who did not wish to partake were sucked into it as others invaded their moieties to claim their people and resources. The Bowland's empire therefore entered into a period of warring states. The only refuge people had during this were the temples that took the mantle of protecting the citizens from the wrathful provincial lords, particularly those of Kudreoth and Yax. After a long, bloody time, a winter of starvation and much wanton death, the holders had exhausted themselves in their claims upon the throne. So one man of shrewd politicking and warfare reunited all of the empire, with exception of the Underwaller's land. It was a tribesman from the north named E-Maka, and he declared his own Bakthmanic dynasty. He was coronated as king and took on the Bowlander name of Fuxuthux. Many of the temples, however, did not accept him, as they saw the old Ruthen dynasty of Meluloth as divinely sanctioned and irreplaceable. The temples entered into a period of controversy, where several of them accepted the new kingship and others rejected it. The tribal king attempted for them to settle it in a series of meetings and compromises, but he grew impatient as unrest developed within the kingdom. When the priests of the temple Yax publicly insulted E-Maka, he had the temple filled with hornets and burnt to the ground, killing many of the priests. This sparked a revolt, which he quickly crushed, and then he rebuilt the temple inside of his own palace. When the tyrant aged, he had his new puppet temple of Yax coronate him again, and he claimed himself to be a god, an incarnation of Yax brought down to oversee a cosmic rebirth. He died shortly after, as Yax does not take kindly to arrogance. His son, named A Nu Mangro, ascended to the throne and took the Bowlander name of Aluy. He was a weak king, as when Eldisa was raided by warriors from the Nial Valley, the Eldisans defended their land without any aid or acknowledgement from the king. Eldisa then took its own independence, and King A Nu Mangro did not press his claim to it. This caused great controversy among the holder class of the state, which ended with another assassination of the king. The kingdom then descended again into a brief period of warring states, but 5 holders came together to quickly reassert authority over the kingdom, and so started the era of the 5 king oligarchs. They all had themselves crowned to be at equal station of the king, just now with the kingship having 5 heads. If you have ever seen the prevalent Bowlander symbol of the 5-headed flaming hawk, know that it came out of this state of the kingdom, and this stayed the government of the kingdom for several years with newfound stability. As one oligarchic king died, they ensured that his sons and relatives properly took their place. But the pleasing isolation of this region gave way to the explosive conquests of the nomadic hordes from the fields to their south. When the empire of the Gyaritom nomads arrived at the gates with promises of great brutality, their general convinced one of the 5 kings to turn over the southern lands of the kingdom, and this one king would be elevated as the sole ruler of the Bowlland's north. The Gyaritom then rode in without a fight, and they swiftly executed the other 4 kings. They forced the new leaders of the Bowlland kingdom into a very odd ritual, where they shaved down all of the fur from their face and head and mixed it into a jar, which they then brought back south to the leader of their nomadic hordes so that he may inherit the divine recognition of these newly conquered territories. Thus, the civilians now call the Bowland Kingdom the mocking name of the bald-headed empire. The state was split and vassalized under the barbarian hordes, and this is where it stands today. My Master Lord Kulerikusa, I humbly report to you that I am happy and in good demeanor in my travels. I can only hope the same for you and our benevolent kingdom back at home. Thanks for listening.